Earl James Washington had been coming to the Calloway County Fair for 44 years. The first time he was 24 years old. His father drove him in a truck that shook over every road seam, and his mother packed sandwiches in a paper bag because she did not trust fair food, and she did not trust the hour they left home, and she was not going to let her son go hungry on the day he first showed his produce. That first year, Earl brought 17 items: tomatoes, peppers, 3 varieties of squash, a jar of sourwood honey from the hive his father kept near the east fence line, dried herbs tied with twine, a small pumpkin that had come out of the ground perfectly round the way pumpkins rarely did. He set them up on a folding table and stood beside them all day. He smiled at every judge who came near. He answered questions when they were asked. He lost. He did not win a single ribbon in any category. He drove home that evening with all 17 items still in the crate, and his mother told him that losing the first time meant you understood what you were working toward. His father said nothing. His father just nodded in the way he nodded when he agreed with something that did not need him to add to it. Earl came back the next year. He brought 19 items. He lost again. He came back the year after that. In the third year, he won his first ribbon. It was not the blue one. It was red second place for a beefsteak tomato that had grown to a size that made the judge hold it in both hands and turn it slowly as though confirming it was real. Earl stood there and watched the judge hold his tomato, and he felt something he could not name at the time, but understood later was the specific satisfaction of knowing that what you had decided to do was the right thing to have decided. He kept that red ribbon. He was 26 years old, and he kept that ribbon in the same wooden box where his father kept important papers, and he did not explain to his father that he had put it there, and his father did not mention finding it. 6 years later, Earl James Washington won his first blue ribbon. He was 32. He had been farming full-time for 9 years. He had expanded from the original 12 acres his grandfather had left to 31 acres by then, buying a parcel here and a parcel there, when the price was right and the soil tested well and the neighbors were willing. He was growing a variety of corn that year that required a specific soil amendment in the third week of June, a narrow window that most farmers found too demanding to be worth the yield. Earl found the window satisfying. He found that the work that cost the most gave back the most, not always in ribbons, but in the particular quality of attention it required. And that quality of attention was what he had been building since he first drove out to the fair with his mother's sandwiches. The blue ribbon that year was for that corn. He brought it home and held it for a long time at the kitchen table before he knew what to do with it. He put it on the wall. The following year, he won the blue ribbon again. For the same corn tended through the same June window, but with a variation in the harvest timing he had been testing for 2 seasons. The year after that, and the year after that. By the time Earl James Washington was 67 years old, he had won the Calloway County Fair Agricultural Excellence Ribbon for 19 consecutive years. His daughter Vivian made a frame for his 60th birthday. She had it custom built by a woodworker in Charlotte, a man who made museum cases, and she had shipped it up to the farm in a long flat box, and Earl had opened it at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon and not said anything for a long time. The frame held the first 19 ribbons in order, each one pinned flat under glass, the years marked in small, neat letters below each one on a strip of archival paper that the woodworker had typed on a machine he kept for exactly that purpose. The frame was on the wall above the kitchen table. Earl ate breakfast looking at it every morning. He had eaten breakfast at that table for 45 years. He planned to eat breakfast there for as long as his body cooperated. He woke at 5:15 every morning. He had not needed an alarm clock since approximately year 10 of farming because his body had reached an agreement with the hour. He made coffee first, using the percolator his parents had owned, the steel one with the handle that had been rewrapped twice. He drank it at the table with the window open in summer and the lights on in winter. He thought through the day without making a list. He had learned early that the day arranged itself better when you sat quietly and let it, rather than writing down instructions that the morning would revise anyway. By 5:40 he was outside. He walked the fields before the temperature climbed because the morning told you things the afternoon was too busy to say. He walked the same path with variations, and he looked at the soil and crouched and put his fingers in it and felt what the night had done and what the season required. He had done this for 45 years. The land rewarded the kind of attention that did not waver and did not require conditions. He intended to keep giving it that attention for as long as the body cooperated with the 515. The land that Earl farmed had been in the Washington family since 1951. His grandfather, Clarence Washington, had worked 2 jobs for 12 years to buy it. Clarence worked days at a lumber yard in town and nights at a commercial laundry, and he kept his savings in a metal box he had welded himself from sheet steel. And he did not explain to anyone what he was saving for, because people who understood what he was doing would either try to talk him out of it or try to involve themselves in it. And he wanted neither. In the spring of 1951, Clarence Washington had enough. He walked into the county land office on a Tuesday morning with a money order for the full amount, the name of the parcel he wanted, and the name of the man who had listed it for sale. He was in the office for 45 minutes. He came out with a deed in his hand. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. He did not celebrate. He walked to the notary 2 blocks away and had the deed notarized. Then he walked to a second notary on the other side of town and had it notarized again. Then he drove to the county seat and had it notarized a 3rd time at the county recorder's office, which was also where it was formally registered. He had heard stories. Papers disappeared. Records were corrected. Notarizations were challenged. He intended none of that to happen to his deed. He brought it home and gave the original to his wife, Eleanor, and told her where to keep it, and she kept it there for 40 years without it leaving that spot. The lockbox Clarence had bolted to the floor beneath the bedroom closet was still there. Earl had never moved it. He had used it for 45 years to store documents he considered too important for the filing cabinet. The original deed had passed from Eleanor to Earl's father, Henry, and from Henry to Earl, and it was now in a safe deposit box at First National Calloway Drawer 114, alongside a copy of Henry's death certificate. The letter from the governor's agricultural office recognizing the Washington farm's contribution to county food security in 2019 and the original school district contract. The school district contract mattered to Earl in a way he found difficult to explain to people who had not grown up watching their father explain to strangers why the farm was worth keeping. 11 schools in Calloway County received produce through the district's local sourcing program. Earl supplied the tomatoes. He supplied the summer squash and the winter squash and the bell peppers and the sweet corn, and in the fall the butternut squash that the school nutrition coordinator, a woman named Greta Hale, had specifically requested after seeing it at a county agricultural showcase. He had been supplying the district for 14 years. Greta called him in February every year to discuss the upcoming season, and Earl always picked up on the second ring because he kept the office phone on a hook by the window where he could see it from the desk. They always talked for at least 40 minutes. Greta had strong opinions about how to introduce vegetables to children who had decided they did not like vegetables, and she had 15 years of data behind those opinions, and Earl respected strong opinions backed by data because that was what farming was. You observed, you recorded, you adjusted, you observed again. You did not skip steps. He also supplied 11 restaurants. Tony DeLuca had been buying from Earl for 22 years. Tony's restaurant was called DeLuca's, and it had been on Main Street in Calloway for 31 years, and it made the kind of food that appeared simple and required the kind of ingredients that only appeared simple if you had never tried to grow them. Tony had a standing Thursday delivery from the Washington farm. He had never missed a Thursday in 22 years. When Ruth was sick, Earl's wife, who had passed 6 years ago, Tony had driven out to the farm himself on 2 Thursdays, when Earl had not been able to manage the delivery, and he had picked up what was ready and left a container of soup on the porch without knocking. He did not knock because he knew Earl was inside. He knew Earl did not need anyone asking how he was doing. Tony had never mentioned the soup. Earl had never mentioned it either. The understanding between them did not require mentioning. It lived in the 22 years and the Thursday deliveries and the way Tony had learned somewhere around year 8 exactly when to show up at the farm and when to wait for the delivery to come to him. Sarah Kim had been buying from Earl for 8 years. Her restaurant was called The Kitchen Table, and it was the kind of place where the menu changed weekly because Sarah refused to serve anything her suppliers could not grow at that exact point in the season. She had found Earl through Tony. She had called the farm on a Tuesday afternoon and introduced herself and asked 3 specific questions about soil management before she asked about prices. Earl had decided within 6 minutes that she understood what she was asking about. He had been supplying her ever since. He thought of Tony and Sarah not as customers, but as the people who completed the work. He grew it. They transformed it. The people in the county ate it. That was a system that had been functioning for 22 years and 8 years, respectively. And Earl believed that a system that functioned for that long had earned the right to be called something. He called it what I do. Ruth Washington had passed on a Thursday in October 6 years ago. She had been sick for 14 months. She had spent 11 of those months telling Earl that the farm would be fine and that he should not stop the Thursday deliveries on her account, and that he should not change anything on her account. Earl had told her that he intended to stop everything if she asked him to. She had looked at him the way she had looked at him since they were 19 years old. She had looked at him and not said anything for a moment. Then she said, "I am not going to ask you to stop anything. Don't be foolish." He was not foolish. He kept everything going. He had kept the deliveries. He had kept the fields. He had kept the kitchen table where they had eaten breakfast together for 42 years. And he had kept the chair across from his, and he had kept the window above the table that looked out toward the east field where the light came in at 6 in the morning and made everything look the way it looked on the first clear day after rain. His daughter Vivian had come from Charlotte with her husband Marcus, and the 2 grandchildren, Lily and James, and she had stayed for 6 weeks after the funeral, and then she had gone back because Earl had told her she should. James was 11 now. Lily was 8. They came every summer for 3 weeks, and every Christmas for 10 days, and James had been coming to the county fair with Earl since he was 5 years old. James liked the livestock barn. He liked the smell of it, which Earl noticed was an unusual preference for a child raised in a city. He also liked the soil. He would walk into a field with Earl and crouch down and put his fingers into the earth the way Earl had shown him, and hold them there for a moment before standing. James had said once when he was 9 years old that he thought he might want to farm the land someday. Earl had not answered immediately. He had thought about what his own father had told him when Earl said the same thing at 9 years old. His father had said that is not a small thing to want. Make sure you want the whole thing, not just the idea of it. Earl said the same words to James. James had looked at his hands still dirty from the field and said, "I want the whole thing." Earl had said, "Then you'll have to learn the whole thing." James said, "I know." That was the conversation. It was the same conversation Clarence had probably had with someone Earl thought at some point before he started working 2 jobs. The 44th Calloway County Fair opened on a Thursday in August. Earl had been preparing for 2 months. He did not wait until the final weeks. He began in June identifying the varieties he would display, setting aside the best specimens from each harvest, checking the display materials, replacing the linen liner on the display basket that had faded from 3 seasons of use. His display table had been reserved since February. Exhibit number AG-0014. He had held a G0014 for 44 years. The fair registrar was a woman named Dolores Marsh, who had been running registration for 18 years. She sent Earl his confirmation letter every February with a handwritten note at the bottom. This year's note said, "44 years, Mr. Washington. Looking forward to seeing the display. First ribbon on the wall since 1992. You've outlasted us all." He had read it twice before he put it in the Fair Current folder on the desk. Margaret Holloway had been Fair Committee President for 15 years. She had known Earl since before she was on the committee. She had been an attendee, a regular someone who made the circuit of the pavilions on opening day, and came back for the agricultural section every time, because the agricultural section was what made the fair a fair, rather than an entertainment event. She had stopped at Earl's table in her 3rd year attending. She had looked at the display and asked him about the variety of squash on the back row. He had explained it. She had bought a jar of the sourwood honey. She had come back the following year. She had been on the committee for 12 years when she was elected president. She sent Earl his invitation letter personally every year. This year's letter said what it always said, with an addition at the bottom. It said, "This year marks your 19th consecutive blue ribbon, Earl. There is no one in this county who has earned that, and we are grateful you keep coming back." Earl arrived at the fairgrounds at 6:45 in the morning. He drove the farm truck. James was not with him yet. Vivian was bringing the children at 7:30 after breakfast because Lily needed breakfast to be civil and James had been awake since 5, but Vivian had made him wait. The bed of the truck held the display items. 3 varieties of heirloom tomatoes in wooden crates lined with newspaper from the previous week's Gazette. Summer squash arranged in a flat basket with a linen liner, the replacement liner he had chosen in June. A bundle of sweet corn, the variety he had been growing since his first blue ribbon year. still the same strain maintained through careful seed selection over 32 seasons. Bell peppers in 4 colors, a small jar of honey with a handwritten label in his own handwriting, the same handwriting he had been using on fair labels since his first year. The wooden stand he had built from scrap lumber from the old barn 21 years ago. He had built it because the standard display tables did not allow for enough height variation, and he wanted the back row to be visible from a distance. He had made the frame from 2x4s and cut the surface from a piece of barn siding that had dried well over the years. He had sanded it until it was smooth. He had oiled it with linseed oil until the grain of the old wood came through. It still held up. He expected it to hold up for another 20 years. Earl parked near the side entrance of the agricultural pavilion where the loading access was clear. He began unloading. He had done this enough times that the sequence was automatic. He knew which crate to take in first. He knew which end of the display table the honey went on and which end the corn went on. He knew how much space to leave between items so that nothing crowded anything else. He knew the angle to set the wooden stand at so that it caught the light from the east-facing windows of the pavilion correctly. He set up the tomatoes in the center row first because the colors were the strongest visual element. He was placing the summer squash in the basket and adjusting the linen liner when he heard footsteps behind him. He did not turn immediately. He finished placing the squash. Then he turned. The officer was young. Earl noticed that first. He had the look of someone in his early 30s who had been given an assignment and taken it seriously without yet understanding all of what serious meant. His name tag said Simmons. He stopped approximately 4 feet from Earl's display table. He looked at the items on the table. He looked at Earl. He said, "This section is reserved for registered agricultural exhibitors." Earl set down the piece of squash he had been holding. He said, "Yes, sir, I know that. I am one." He reached into the front pocket of his overalls. He produced the registration card. The registration card was printed on cardstock and had his name Earl J. Washington, his exhibit number, AG-0014, his table assignment, AISL C Table 1, and the Fair Committee's official stamp in the lower right corner, the stamp that had been applied by Dolores Marsh every year for 18 years. He held the card out. Simmons looked at it. His expression did not change. He said, "I need to see something with your photo." Earl looked at him for a moment. He said, "I have my driver's license." He produced his wallet. He opened it to the license and held it so that both the registration card and the license were visible simultaneously. His name was on both documents. His exhibit number was on the registration card. His photograph was on the license. Simmons looked at both. He said, "Where is your setup authorization form?" Earl said, "This is my setup authorization. The registration card is what authorizes exhibitor setup. That's been the procedure since I've been coming here." Simmons said, "There is a separate form this year. You should have received it with your registration packet." Earl said, "I received my packet in February. It had the registration card and the exhibit letter and the parking pass and the fare schedule insert. There was no additional form." He said it the way he said things when he had checked. He had gone through the packet twice in February when it arrived and twice again the previous week when he was reviewing the display plan. There had been no additional form. Simmons said, "I'm going to need you to step away from the table while I verify." Earl said, "I have been setting up at this table for 44 years. My exhibit number is AG-0014, which is the lowest active number in this pavilion. If you call the fair registration office, the registrar will confirm my status in under a minute." Simmons said, "I'm going to need you to step away from the table." He said it the same way both times. Earl put both hands flat on the edge of the display table. He did not step away. He looked at Officer Simmons, and he said, "I am going to stay at my display table. The registration card and my identification are right here. If you would like to call the fair office to confirm, I will wait while you do that. I would like to finish setting up before the doors open." Simmons reached for his radio. The radio conversation lasted 4 minutes. Earl continued setting up the display while Simmons talked. He placed the heirloom tomatoes in the configuration he had worked out in his head on the drive over. He placed the red varieties at the center. He set the orange and yellow varieties on either side. He adjusted the wooden stand 3 times before the angle was right. He uncovered the corn and arranged the ears so the husks faced the same direction. He was positioning the bell peppers by color when Simmons finished on the radio. Simmons walked back to the table. He said, "Dispatch is still verifying. I need you to come with me until that's confirmed." Earl said, "I'll wait here until it's confirmed." Simmons said, "Sir." Earl said, "My name is Earl Washington. This is Exhibit AG-0014. I have been at this table every year for 44 years. I am going to stand here while your office confirms my registration." Simmons looked at Earl. He looked at the display. He looked at the registration card still sitting visible on the corner of the table where Earl had placed it after showing it. He looked at the driver's license. He looked at Earl again. Something changed in his expression. It was not the look of a man finding new information. It was the look of a man who had already decided something and was now committing to that decision in a way that would be difficult to reverse. He said, "Sir, I need you to put your hands behind your back." Earl James Washington was 68 years old. He had come to this fair for 44 consecutive years. He had been farming for 45 years. He had built a farm from 12 acres to 187. He had buried his wife and kept the deliveries running. He had fed 11 schools and 11 restaurants and built a display stand that had outlasted most of the equipment in the pavilion. He was standing at his own table with his registration card in plain sight. He thought about Clarence walking into the county land office in 1951 with a money order and coming out with a deed. He thought about Clarence notarizing that deed 3 times. He thought about the metal lockbox bolted to the floor. He thought about his father saying that is not a small thing to want. He put his hands behind his back. He did not say anything. He stood still while Officer Derek Simmons placed the handcuffs on his wrists. The metal was cool. He noticed that. He noticed the weight of it and the specific sound the mechanism made, and the way his shoulders adjusted automatically to the new position. He looked at the heirloom tomatoes on the center row of his display. He had selected them individually from the morning harvest. He had held each one and assessed its color, its weight, the firmness at the stem end. He had rejected 8 before choosing the ones on the table. He looked at the wooden stand 21 years old holding up. He thought about the morning he had built it in the back of the barn, after Ruth had gone in to make dinner from 2x4s and barn siding and the linseed oil he had bought specifically for it. He thought about Clarence walking out of the land office with a deed. He thought about Eleanor keeping that deed flat and dry for 40 years. He thought about the metal lockbox bolted to the floor. He thought about all of it. He thought they can do what they're doing right now, and none of it changes what Clarence built, and none of it changes what Henry built, and none of it changes what I have built. He thought the farm is fine. He stood still. Tony DeLuca had arrived at the fairgrounds at 7:20. He came every opening day at 7:20. He had come since the year he first started buying from Earl, which was year 23 of the fair for Earl, and the beginning of something Tony could not have named at the time, but recognized later as the relationship that shaped the restaurant more than any other. He parked near the side entrance and walked through because he knew the path. He saw Earl from 30 yards. He saw the handcuffs before he understood what he was seeing. He stood still for a full 3 seconds. Then he walked forward. He said, "Earl." Earl looked over at him. Earl's expression did not change. He said, "Good morning, Tony. Display's almost done." Tony stood there for another moment before he could speak. He said, "What is happening right now?" Earl said, "This officer is verifying my registration." Tony turned to Simmons. He was not a large man, Tony DeLuca. He was 5'8" and lean from the kind of hours restaurant work put on a body. But he put himself between Simmons and the table in a way that did not require size to communicate. He said, "I know this man. His name is Earl Washington. He is Exhibit AG-0014. He has been coming to this fair for 44 years. He has been supplying my restaurant for 22 years. I have eaten his produce at this table at this exhibit for 19 opening days. What do you need in order to confirm that he belongs here?" Simmons said, "Sir, please step back from the area." Tony said, "I am not going to step back from the area. His registration card is on the table. His driver's license is on the table. You have placed handcuffs on a man who supplied 1,200 pounds of produce to this county last month alone. Tell me what you need in order to correct this." Simmons said, "I am handling a situation." Tony said, "You are standing in front of a man who has been feeding this county for 45 years. I would like you to explain what situation you are handling." Simmons did not answer. Tony looked at Earl. Earl said, "It's all right, Tony. It will get sorted." Tony said, "It will get sorted right now." He pulled out his phone. Margaret Holloway arrived at 7:30 on the dot. She arrived at 7:30 on every opening day. She walked the pavilions before the public came in because she liked to see the displays when they were still being finished, when they still held the quality of preparation and not yet performance. She had done this for 15 years. She came around the east corner of the agricultural pavilion with a clipboard and a cup of coffee from the committee room, and she stopped walking the moment she saw the scene. She stopped walking for 1 second. Then she moved forward at a pace that was faster than her normal pace without being a run. She said Earl. Earl said, "Good morning, Margaret." She turned to Simmons. She said, "I am Margaret Holloway. I am the president of the Calloway County Fair Committee. I need you to explain what is happening at this exhibitor's table." Simmons said, "Ma'am, this individual was unable to provide adequate documentation for." Margaret said his name is Earl Washington. His exhibit is AG-0014. He has held that exhibit for 44 years. I personally wrote and mailed his invitation to this fair 3 months ago. What documentation is he lacking? Simmons said he could not produce a setup authorization form separate from. Margaret said there is no separate setup authorization form. There has never been one. I wrote the exhibitor registration protocol 12 years ago when I joined the committee. The registration card is the authorization. It is the only authorization that exists. Simmons said, "I received information from a vendor that indicated." Margaret said, "A vendor told you something about registration protocol that was incorrect, and you acted on that information without verifying it with the fair office, and you placed handcuffs on a man whose registration card is sitting on his display table, where you can read it from where you're standing." She said it without raising her voice. She said it the way people say things when they are being precise. Simmons said, "I cannot remove the restraints until my supervisor." Margaret said, "Please contact your supervisor. I will wait. And while we wait, I would like you to think about what your supervisor is going to see when they arrive. They are going to see the man who has held Exhibit AG-0014 for longer than any other active exhibitor in this pavilion. They are going to see the man who won the Agricultural Excellence Ribbon for 19 consecutive years. They are going to see the man who sat on the founding Agriculture Committee in 1992 when we redesigned this exact section of this pavilion. And they are going to see his registration card and his driver's license sitting on his display table in plain sight." Simmons reached for his radio again. Margaret looked at Earl. Earl said, "How is the committee this year?" Margaret said, "We had a good winter session. The livestock categories are expanded." Earl said, "I heard. That's a good change." They talked about the livestock categories while Simmons called his supervisor. The word moved through the fairgrounds the way news moved through a place where everyone knew everyone. It moved fast and it moved accurately, and it arrived carrying enough detail that people knew exactly what they were hearing before they asked a follow-up question. Sarah Kim heard it at 7:42 from her produce contact near the entrance. She had been at the fair early to check her vendor relationship with the farm-to-table showcase in the commercial pavilion. She put her phone in her pocket and walked. She came around the corner and saw the scene, and she did what Tony had done. She stood still for a moment. Then she walked to where Earl was standing. She said, "Earl, I am here." Earl said, "Sarah, the squash came in beautifully this year, best variety in 3 seasons." She said, "I know. I drove out to the farm last week. The squash was the reason I came." She turned to Simmons. She said, "I am Sarah Kim. I own the kitchen table restaurant on 2nd Street. This man has been supplying my restaurant for 8 years. I want you to look at that display table. I want you to look at what is on it. That produce grew in the soil of this county from a man who has been farming that soil for 45 years. He feeds students in the school lunch program. He feeds families through 11 restaurants. He has been coming to this fair for every year since before either of us could drive. Whatever you believe you are doing, you are wrong, and you need to stop." She said the last part quietly, but clearly. Raymond Hammond had taught agricultural science at Calloway High School for 23 years. He brought a group of students to the county fair every year as part of the fall semester agriculture curriculum. He also brought them to the Washington farm twice a year, once in April and once in September, because Earl had agreed 8 years ago to allow it. The agreement had been simple. Raymond had called the farm and explained the program. Earl had asked 2 questions. He asked, "What do you want them to learn?" Raymond had said how farming works. Not the idea of it, the actual thing. Earl had said, "Bring them in the morning. We'll start at the south field." That had been 8 years ago. This year's group of 6 students was 16 and 17 years old. 3 of them had grown up eating produce from the Washington farm through the school lunch program without knowing it. They came around the east corner of the pavilion behind Raymond and stopped. They saw the scene. Raymond said nothing for a moment. He looked at Earl. Earl was standing straight. His hands were behind his back. His display was behind him, mostly finished, the wooden stand in place. Raymond walked forward. He said, "This man taught my students what farming this land means. He has been farming it since before most of their parents were born. I need you to tell me what is happening." "Simmons said, sir, this is a county matter. I need everyone to." Raymond turned to the students. He said, "Stay behind me." He turned back. He said, "This is also a county matter to me. I teach in this county. My students eat food from this farm. We have walked these fields. We have put our hands in this soil. What is happening at this table is also my business." Simmons said, "I need everyone to step back." Nobody stepped back. The circle that formed over the following 22 minutes was not organized. No one planned it. No one sent a signal. People heard what was happening and they came. Some came because they knew Earl. Some came because they bought his produce at the Saturday farmers market on the courthouse square and had been doing it for 15 years. Some came because their children attended one of the 11 schools in the county lunch program and had come home talking about the corn that year. Some came because they had been attending this fair for 20 years, and AG-0014 was the first table they visited every opening day. A woman named Celia Marsh, 72 years old, who had known Earl's mother, came because her daughter called her. A man named Pete Hoover, who ran the county extension office, came because Tony DeLuca sent him a text message with 3 words, "Agricultural Pavilion now." A group of 4 women who had been setting up the quilting exhibit in the adjacent pavilion came because one of them looked out the connecting door and saw the circle forming and understood what it meant. They stood. They stood in a circle around Earl James Washington and Officer Derek Simmons and the display table with the heirloom tomatoes and the summer squash and the sweet corn and the bell peppers in 4 colors and the jar of honey and the wooden stand. 47 people stood in a circle. None of them shouted. None of them threatened. None of them rushed forward. They stood. They stood with the specific and quiet weight of people who had come to say, "We see this. We are not leaving." Some of them had known Earl for 30 years. Some of them had never met him. What they shared was the county. They had eaten from the same soil. They had sent their children to the same schools. They had bought produce at the same Saturday market and driven the same county roads past the Washington farm and seen the fields in every season from the road, and known in the way you know a thing you see regularly that someone was out there working. They had not known exactly what to do with that knowledge until now. Now they knew. They stood in a circle. Simmons looked at the circle. He turned slowly. He looked at all 47 faces. He said, "I need everyone to disperse." Nobody moved. He said, "This is a county matter, and I need everyone to." Nobody moved. He stopped talking. The circle held. It held the way things hold when 47 people have each independently made the same decision. Vivienne Washington had arrived at the fairgrounds at 7:45 with James and Lily. She had texted Earl at 7:30 to say they were leaving the motel. He had not responded. She was not worried yet. She knew he was setting up, and he did not always keep the phone in his pocket when he was working. James had been talking about the agricultural pavilion since they left the motel. He knew which way to walk. He had been walking this way since he was 5. He came around the east corner of the agricultural pavilion and stopped. He was 11 years old, and he had learned the fair by following his grandfather, and the first thing he had learned was that the agricultural pavilion on opening morning was quiet. It was not quiet. There were people, many people, standing in a circle. James moved to the edge of the circle because he was smaller and the circle had gaps. He looked through the gap between 2 adults. He saw his grandfather. He saw the handcuffs. He was very still. He did not make a sound. Earl was standing at his display table and he was looking at the tomatoes on the center row, and then he looked up and he saw James. Their eyes found each other across the circle the way eyes do when you are looking for someone specific. Earl's face did not change. He held his grandson's gaze across the circle of 47 people, and he held it steadily, and his expression said without words, "I am still here. I am exactly who I was when you saw me this morning. Do not be afraid of this." James looked back at his grandfather, and he did not look away. He stood there. Vivienne came up behind him and put her hand on his shoulder, and she saw what he was looking at, and she did not say anything. She kept her hand on his shoulder. They waited. County Commissioner Ruth Patterson arrived at 8:14. She had received the first call from Margaret Holloway at 7:37. She had received the second call from Pete Hoover at 7:41. The third call came from a number she did not have in her contacts, and when she answered it, a woman said, "Commissioner, it's Celia Marsh. You need to come to the agricultural pavilion right now. They have put Earl Washington in handcuffs." Ruth Patterson had known Earl Washington for 16 years. She had attended his wife's funeral. She had visited the Washington farm 3 times for county agricultural showcases. She had cited the Washington farm specifically in her 2021 County Economic Impact Report as an example of generational agricultural commitment. She drove herself to the fairgrounds. Captain Gerald Foster had arrived 4 minutes ahead of her. Foster had 18 years on the department. He had received the radio call from Simmons requesting supervisor response, and he had arrived at the pavilion at 8:10. He had spent 4 minutes absorbing the scene before the commissioner arrived. He had looked at the circle. He had counted 47 people standing quietly. He had looked at Earl. He had looked at the display table. He had seen the registration card. He had seen the driver's license. He had walked to within 8 feet of the table and read the registration card without touching it, a G-0014. He had understood in approximately 60 seconds what had happened and approximately 60 more seconds to understand the full scope of it. Commissioner Patterson walked through the crowd, which parted for her. She walked to where Foster was standing. She said, "Gerald." He said, "Ruth." She said, "Tell me what I'm looking at." He said, "A mistake." She said, "I would like it corrected." He did not hesitate. He turned to Simmons. He said, "Officer, remove the restraints." Simmons said, "Captain, I was in the process of—" Foster said, "Remove the restraints now." There was something in Foster's voice that made the sentence function as the last sentence on a subject. Simmons removed the handcuffs. Earl James Washington brought his hands forward. He stood still for a moment. He looked at his wrists. He rotated each wrist once slowly. He looked at the display table. He turned to it. He straightened the corner of the squash basket that had shifted while he was not able to tend to it. He repositioned the center row of heirloom tomatoes. He moved the jar of honey 3 inches to the left because the angle had been wrong since he set it down. He did this while 47 people stood in the circle and watched. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The circle waited while Earl finished. He turned around and looked at the circle. He said to no one in particular, "Thank you for being here." Then people began to move, not because they were dismissed, not because anyone told them to go, because the thing that had needed to happen had happened, and the circle had done its work, and now the fair was about to open and there was work to do. Tony put his hand on Earl's shoulder for a moment. He did not say anything. He walked back toward the commercial entrance. Sarah nodded once. She walked back toward the farm-to-table showcase. Raymond turned to his students. "He said you saw that. Remember it. We'll talk about it on Monday." He did not explain further. He did not need to. Commissioner Patterson spoke with Simmons and Foster for 14 minutes in the space behind the livestock registration desk. Earl did not hear what was said. He was talking with Margaret about the expanded livestock categories and what it meant for the overall fair attendance. He was listening to Tony, who had come back for a few minutes after all talk about a preparation he had been developing with the heirloom tomatoes. He was watching James. James had come forward after the circle dispersed. He stood at the edge of Earl's display space. He was looking at the display. He was looking at all of it. The tomatoes and the squash and the corn and the peppers and the honey and the wooden stand. Earl had not yet brought in the ribbon frame. It was still in the truck. He looked at James. He said, "James, come help me with something." James walked over. They walked to the truck together. Earl opened the door and reached behind the seat. He pulled out the ribbon frame. He held one end out to James. James took it. They carried it together through the side entrance and back to the display. Earl had put a hook on the display wall 12 years ago. He hung the frame, 19 blue ribbons under glass, the years in small neat letters below each one. James stood beside his grandfather and looked at the frame. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Grandpa, what happened today?" Earl said, "An officer made a mistake." James said, "Because of how you look." Earl said, "Probably." James said, "That's not fair." Earl said, "No, it's not." James was quiet again. He said, "How do you not feel?" He stopped. He was 11 years old, and the sentence had more inside it than he knew how to get out. Earl waited. James said, "How do you not feel like it changes everything?" Earl said, "Because it doesn't. What they do to you changes what they are. It doesn't change what you built. Those are 2 different things. You have to keep them separate. If you let them be the same thing, you give them something they didn't earn." James looked at the ribbons. He said grandfather Clarence never got to see the fair. Earl said no. He died in 1963, 3 years after I was born. James said, but his land is here. Earl said his land is here. His deed is in drawer 114 at First National. His notarizations are there, all 3 of them. He bolted the lockbox to the floor so it couldn't be moved, and it's still there. James said nothing, they did stopped it. Earl said nothing, they did stopped it. James looked at the ribbons again. He said his next year 20. Earl said if I do the work. James said we'll do the work. Earl looked at him. He said yes, we will. Earl remained at his display through the full opening day. The fair opened to the public at 9. People came to AG 0014 throughout the morning. Some came because they always came. Some came because they had been in the circle and wanted to see the display properly now that the situation had resolved. Some came because Tony DeLuca had texted 6 people from the table area, and 3 of them had told 5 more people each. Earl answered questions about the varieties. He explained the soil amendment schedule for the corn. He described the sourwood honey and where the hive sat relative to the east fence line. He sold 11 jars of honey by 11 o'clock. He sold out of the red heirloom tomatoes by noon. He had a sign ready, a small card he made every year for the items that ran out. The card said sold out. Thank you, same table next year. James stayed at the display all morning. He watched the way his grandfather talked to people. He watched the rhythm of it. He noticed that Earl never hurried. He noticed that Earl gave the same quality of attention to the person asking the 5th question as to the person who had asked the first. He stored that. He would know later when he was older what he had been watching. The formal administrative review report was completed 12 days later. Officer Derek Simmons had been assigned to the agricultural pavilion for the first time in his 5 years on the department. He had received an exhibitor protocol briefing 2 days before the fair. The briefing had covered registration card verification, exhibitor identification procedures, and escalation protocol. Simmons had received the briefing correctly. After the briefing, he had spoken with a commercial vendor near the north entrance who mentioned a separate authorization form. The vendor was referencing a form that had been used 3 years prior and discontinued. Simmons had not verified the vendor's information with the fair office. He had not checked the department briefing materials he had received 2 days earlier. He had acted on an outdated second-hand reference. The report also noted that Simmons had 2 prior complaints in his file. Both prior complaints involved situations in which he had demanded identification without sufficient cause. Neither had resulted in formal discipline. The report found that Simmons had failed to read the visible exhibitor documentation before escalating, failed to contact the fair registration office for verification, before applying restraints, and failed to apply the de-escalation protocol that department training required. He was suspended without pay for 14 days. He was required to complete a 50-hour retraining program before returning to duty. The department issued a formal written apology to Earl James Washington. Commissioner Patterson issued a public statement. The statement said that the Washington family had been farming Calloway County soil for 70 years, and that the county's agricultural identity was built in significant part on exactly that kind of generational commitment. The statement said that what had occurred on the opening morning of the Calloway County Fair was a failure, and that the county intended to address it completely. The statement also named Earl specifically. It said, Earl Washington has held Exhibit AG-0014 for 44 years. He has fed our schools and our restaurants and our families. He has won 19 consecutive agricultural excellence ribbons. He has been a part of this fair longer than most of the people who run it. That he was treated the way he was treated on Thursday morning is something we will not explain away. The statement ended there. The fair committee met in emergency session the Thursday evening after opening day. Margaret Holloway called the meeting at 6 o'clock. 9 of the 12 committee members attended. They were in the committee room for 38 minutes. At the end of the 38 minutes, they voted 7-2 to rename the Agricultural Excellence Award. Beginning the following year, the annual ribbon would be awarded under the name the Earl Washington Prize. They sent him a letter the following morning. Earl read it at the kitchen table. He set it down on the table. He looked at the ribbon frame on the wall. He thought about the 2 votes against. He thought about them for a few minutes. He thought about what they meant and what they didn't mean, and whether they were the kind of thing you held on to or the kind of thing you set down. He thought about Dorothy Hale, who had run the fair registration desk in the early years when he was winning his first ribbons, and who had said once that the agricultural pavilion was the reason the fair still mattered to the people who had been farming this county for generations. He thought about Margaret sending his invitation letter every year with the personal note at the bottom. He thought about the 7 votes. He put the letter in the Fair Current folder. He went out to the field. The summer squash needed attention in the second row. He had noticed it the previous evening and had intended to get to it. He got to it. The committee had also voted in the same session that evening to add a formal exhibitor recognition protocol to the fair's security briefing. The new protocol required security personnel to verify exhibitor status directly with the registration office before any escalation involving a credentialed exhibitor. Margaret Holloway wrote the protocol herself. She wrote it in 2 hours on Thursday evening and sent it to the committee for review by Friday morning. It passed without revision. She named the document Exhibitor Verification and De-Escalation Protocol. She did not put Earl's name on it. She thought about it. She decided the protocol should be read as a standard rather than a memorial because standards outlasted the incidents that created them. Carl Novak covered county events for the Calloway Gazette. He had been on the beat for 7 years. He had been at the fairgrounds on opening morning. He had been near the home goods pavilion when he heard the first reports from the agricultural section. He had walked over. He had arrived when the circle was 41 people and growing. He had his notebook out within 2 minutes. He wrote 11 pages of notes. He talked to Tony and Margaret and Sarah and Raymond and 2 of Raymond's students. He talked to Celia Marsh and Pete Hoover and 3 of the women from the quilting exhibit. He requested the administrative incident report through formal channels. He reviewed the exhibitor registration documentation. He found the 2018 Fair archive file that showed Earl's first appearance as AG-0014 in 1980. He found the Renovation Committee records from 1992 showing Earl's name on the founding Agricultural Layout Committee. He found 19 years of blue ribbon certificates on record in the Fair Committee's historical files. His article ran in the Saturday edition. The headline said, "County Fair's longest-standing exhibitor handcuffed at his own display table, the town did not stand still." The article was 3,800 words. He had written longer, but 3,800 was what the story needed. At the end of the article, he had included a quote from Earl. He had asked Earl after everything had resolved and the display was complete, and the fair had opened, and the first visitors had come through and stopped at AG-0014 and bought tomatoes and squash and peppers and honey. "Mr. Washington, what do you want people to know?" Earl had looked at the display. He had looked at the ribbons. He had said, "I have work to do." "I always have work to do." "That's farming. The field doesn't wait because something happened to you. The tomatoes don't know about any of this. They just need what they need. So you give it to them. That's all. You give it to them and you keep going." Carl printed every word. The article was shared 4,900 times by Monday morning. Tony DeLuca shared it on every platform he used. He wrote above the share, "This is the man they put in handcuffs." This is what he said afterward. Read all of it. The AP Wire picked it up on Sunday afternoon. The quote ran in outlets in 14 states. The 45th Calloway County Fair opened on a Thursday in August. Earl arrived at 6:45 in the morning. He drove the farm truck. James was in the passenger seat. He was 12 years old now. He had asked in April during spring break whether he could come up early to help with setup. Vivian had driven him up 2 days before the fair opened. Those 2 days they had worked on the display together. James had learned which varieties Earl was showing before they loaded the truck. He had asked about each variety. He asked about the soil amendment schedule for the corn. He asked about the difference between the 3 tomato varieties and which one gave the best yield in a dry August. Earl answered every question. He answered the way he had answered questions from Raymond Hammond's students, and from Greta Hale when she called in February, and from his father 45 years ago when he was learning what the land required. He answered as though the questions were worth the full answer. They arrived at the side entrance at 6:45. James got out of the truck before Earl did. He went to the bed and looked at the crates. He said tomatoes first. Earl said tomatoes first. James took the first crate. He carried it the way he had watched Earl carry it two-handed level at the right height to see over the top without craning. They set up the display together. James knew the sequence. He had not been told the sequence. He had watched and remembered. He placed the tomatoes without being directed. He adjusted the wooden stand to the right angle. He arranged the corn so the husks faced the same direction. Earl watched him do it. He said nothing. He let the boy work. When everything was set, James turned and looked at the display. He stood there for a moment. Earl said the frame. James nodded. They went to the truck. They brought the frame in together. This year, the frame held 20 ribbons. The 20th was blue. It was the same shade as the other 19. It was the first ribbon awarded under the name the Earl Washington Prize. Earl had won his own award. He had not known exactly how to feel about that, and he had decided over the course of the winter that the feeling would find its shape in time and that he should not force it. He hung the frame on the hook. James stood beside him and looked at it. He counted. He said 20. Earl said 20. James said next year 21. Earl said if I do the work. James said we'll do the work. Earl looked at him. He said yes, we will. He looked at his grandson for a moment, 12 years old, standing in the agricultural pavilion of the Calloway County Fair, beside a display that his grandfather had built and that his grandfather's grandfather had made possible by working 2 jobs for 12 years. Earl thought about the deed in drawer 114 at First National Callaway. He thought about the lockbox bolted to the floor. He thought about Clarence standing on the sidewalk outside the land office in 1951 with a deed in his hand. He thought about Ruth at the kitchen table. He thought about Vivian making the ribbon frame for his 60th birthday. He looked at James. He thought the farm is here. The land is here. The work is here. That was the whole of it. The farm was 187 acres. The school district contract was in its 15th year. The Thursday delivery to Tony's restaurant had not been missed in 23 years. The Wednesday delivery to Sarah Kim had run for 9 years. The wooden display stand built from barn scrap and sanded smooth and oiled with linseed oil had been holding up for 22 years. On the wall above the kitchen table, 20 blue ribbons hung under glass, the years in small letters below each one in the frame Vivian had built for Earl's 60th birthday. The land deed that Clarence Washington had carried home in 1951 was in drawer 114, notarized 3 times in perfect condition, the way things are preserved when someone understands what they are preserving. The 21st year was being planted. Earl had started the seed trays in March the same way he started them every year in the greenhouse his father had built, and he had expanded twice. He had labeled each tray in his own handwriting, the same handwriting that had been on fair labels since 1980. He had set them under the grow lights and checked them every morning at 5:40, the same as every other morning, the same as all the other mornings before this one, and all the mornings still to come. James would be back in the summer. He had already asked. He had called in April and said, "Grandpa, I'm coming for setup week this year, all week." Earl had said, "I'll put you to work." James had said, "I know, that's why I'm coming." That was the conversation. The work did not wait. The work was the answer. Subscribe our channel. We tell the stories of the people who kept working.